So as many of you know, I spend my summers working at the Fine Arts Summer Academy in Nashville, Tennessee. The group that runs that is the Annie Moses Ministries, which is also the Annie Moses Band. And this summer, a neat opportunity I had was to do a teacher training with Annie, Annie Wilbur Dupree. And her background is that she was trained through Juilliard. So this summer, when we went up there, we studied how to teach the Galamian method, which ended up having a lot of impact on my own practice routine because I learned a lot about how to practice technique and how to structure my practice of technique, which made me really happy because I love practicing technique. I'm a nerd. So the background of the Galamian Hour, it was developed by Ivan Galamian, who taught at Juilliard, and he founded Meadowmount. So he taught between about 1924 and 1981 at various places and at different conservatories and stuff, but his main one was Juilliard. So he kind of got the structure of the Galamian Hour kind of started. He passed that on to his student, Dorothy DeLay. Now, at one point in American music education, most of the top seats in symphonies across the country were taken by students of Dorothy DeLay. She had a huge impact on just very excellent violinists. So she took the Galamian Hour and structured it even further. She developed it, she kind of fleshed it out. She taught the Galamian Hour to her teaching assistants, who then Annie studied under. And then I got to study it from Annie. So at this point, it's still very generational. I haven't found a lot on the internet about it, or I haven't found a lot in written literature about the Galamian Hour. So my perception is that it's still a very generational thing that's still spreading. So the Galamian Hour, it's suitable for most students starting at about an intermediate level because it covers things like shifting and vibrato. I talked to Annie on the phone about this. When do you start a student on this? She said about early intermediate, mid-book 3 Suzuki level. But what I found is that a lot of the elements of the Galamian Hour, I've even started with my beginner students, not all of them, of course, and not the exact exercises, but the concepts of these are areas that should be practiced every day, can go back to the very beginnings of teaching violin. And even for myself, some of the exercises in here, I'm like, this is hard. I go through, you'll see a little bit later how it's broken up. I can't even do all the exercises, and it's like, okay, this is something that's a process. It's not something you just jump into and do all the way through. It's something that you do every day, and you gradually advance through and work through, no matter what your level. So I've been looking at it from the standpoint of teaching, because I am a senior. I am preparing to go, actually teach. I already teach through SFA Music Prep. But at the same time, I've been practicing it myself as much as realistically possible. With everything else I have to practice. But I know that for myself, I've already seen improvements in my technique from what I've done. So I'm going to kind of talk through the hour. And afterwards, if you have questions or if you want to see the exercises written out on different papers, I have a whole packet of worksheets. I just didn't print them out for everyone. So the first exercises that you do to start off your practice is all just focusing on your bow hold and bow technique. And they recommend that you spend 15 minutes 15 minutes out of your technique hour on just your bow hold and bow technique, which at first seemed like a lot when I first heard that, because it's like, whoa, we're doing open strings here, I'm supposed to play open strings for 15 minutes. But then as I started doing it, I'm like, Yeah, I need 15 minutes on this. So level 1 requires students, and the levels are, I believe, just added by Annie. Like, I don't know that these are actually part of the full Galamian hour, but I found them really useful in my mind to kind of help me understand how it builds upon itself. Level 1 already requires the student to understand how to make a good bow hold and how to move their hand properly, how to have a really flexible bow hold. So most of my students aren't even to that point yet. So I've been doing a lot of pre-exercises with just moving their bow hold around. But then once you actually start into the Galamian hour, the first 3 exercises that you do, you spend 5 minutes each on, and they're focusing on bow pressure, bow speed, and then contact point. So the first exercise is that you do an open string and you do pressure accents. So you start with just 1 in a bow, then 2, then 4, then 6. So like, all the way up to doing 32 accents in 1 bow. So you practice that for 5 minutes. All you're working on is doing those accents. And I did these at 5:30 in the morning once, and my mom walks in the room and she's like, couldn't you pick something pretty to practice at 5:30 in the morning? I'm like, no. I have to do these before I'm fully conscious and awake and aware of how annoying they are. So the second exercise is bow speed. It's very similar to the bow pressure accent exercise, but this time it's using speed instead. That one you do up to 24 accents in 1 bow. You can't really do 32 because they require more space on the bow than a pressure accent. So you do that for 5 minutes. The final exercise, which I have found to be quite difficult and definitely the hardest of all 3 of these, is contact point. So this is assuming already that you can control your contact point and that you can stay in 1 contact point consistently. So then the exercise is to start at the frog and move from fingerboard to bridge to fingerboard in 1 bow. And then to do that same process twice in 1 bow. That's about as far as I can get. But you're supposed to be able to get, let me see, 16 of those in 1 bow. And actually I got 3 in today. I was so proud of myself. But it's literally just, it's hard. So those 3 exercises, you're supposed to practice those 3 exercises every morning until, well, every time you do the hour, until you've mastered them. Which Annie said that she feels like you should spend about a year just working on those 3 exercises. And I know why, because they develop such control over your bow hand. Like even the ones that I find easier than others, like take so much control and so much focus. So after you are thoroughly proficient at controlling those 3 aspects of using your bow, you move on to level 2, which at this point is practicing more advanced strokes, spiccatos, martelets, collays, blah, 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 blah. So usually at this point you're working on repertoire that requires them. And so you kind of focus your attention on the strokes that are actually used in your repertoire. So it might even be practicing excerpts out of your piece to work on those bow strokes that you're actually applying. So after you spend 15 minutes annoying your parents at 5:30 in the morning, you move on to your left hand and how you're moving that, which is a lot more complicated than you would assume, because you're thinking about things like is my pinky actually curling when I play my fourth fingers? Usually my answer to that is no, and usually then I have to end up fixing that. Am I gripping with my thumb? Am I squeezing? Am I picking my fingers too far off the string? So the exercise, the first exercise that I was given to do for this category was this very simple little exercise that's like, so you start off super slow, and you're supposed to work that up to about 160 beats per minute, and those are 16th notes. So super fast. The whole time you're supposed to have really good articulation. Each note should be really clear. You do that for 3 minutes a day. After about 30 seconds, you're like, okay, I can do this. But then after about a minute, you're like, can I even play the violin? So the other exercise is doing left-hand pizzicato. Which is deceptively difficult, because if you're gripping or if your hand is turned at the wrong angle, when you put your third finger down, you can't pluck with your fourth finger. So it's very revealing. I taught it to a student yesterday, and she looked at me as she just tried to put down her first finger, and she realized all the ways she wasn't holding her violin correctly. It was like, I blew her mind in that instance. She's like, I actually have problems. I need to fix these. It was great. I was like, yes, let me show you what to do so you can practice and learn properly. So the other exercise that Annie recommended was, and I've heard like 6 different ways on how to pronounce this in the last 3 weeks. Annie pronounced it Tradiac, but it's the one, it's just like, so Annie uses the same principle as that first exercise I showed you, where you start off super slow and you slowly increase the tempo up to 160, trying to get each note crystal clear. That's so hard, but it's so much fun. Level 3 is doing subject etudes, and also Annie recommended also taking any runs from your repertoire, just whatever you're actually playing, apply the same processes you used for the etudes into what you're working on for your repertoire. So after you spent 5 minutes doing that, you move on to shifting. Annie uses the Yost book, which is very similar to a lot of other shifting books I've seen. It's basically just, this is a shift. It's one of those type of books. The nice thing about it, for those of y'all who are teaching, it's on IMSLP on a free download, so you can just email it to your students and be like, hey, print this and bring it to your lesson. So you do basic shifting exercises. We've all had to do them. But one thing that Annie did teach that I really enjoyed was, we all know to practice like runs and fast passages and rhythms. She was also saying it's super useful to practice shifting in rhythms. Doing different rhythms on the same shift, and then also doing exercises like that. So that kind of blew my mind. So we've all done those type of shifting exercises, but maybe that gives you a new spin on how to practice them. So after you work your way through a tedious book like Yost or Ida Dofflin, you do that same thing but with your repertoire. So you go through your concerto and you go to every shift and you practice each shift like you would as if it was a shifting exercise, which takes forever, which is why you set a timer for 5 minutes so you don't end up accidentally spending like 45 minutes going through your entire concerto. So after you practice shifting for 5 minutes, you practice vibrato. I hate practicing vibrato. I have never liked practicing vibrato. I have always been terrible at vibrato, and that's for neurological reasons. It took me 3 years to learn how to do vibrato, just to start vibrato. So vibrato is kind of a sore subject in my book, so this is the part of the hour that doesn't usually happen when I'm practicing. But most of us have kind of a way we either learn vibrato or know how to teach vibrato. But what Annie recommended is that while you're learning vibrato, you practice 10 minutes on vibrato and then you do it 2 times. So you do it 1 time in 3rd position and then 1 time in 4th position. And that's just because each of those positions give you something slightly different as far as contact with your instrument. Once you have a vibrato in 3rd or 4th position, you then take it down to 1st position. And then after you have a vibrato in all 3 of those positions, you do vibrato on scales, which I thought was just a really interesting way of putting it. I liked how she had kind of that progression. She also made a point to say that after you learn vibrato in 1st, 3rd, and 4th, it's important to then spend time learning how to do vibrato in the upper positions because it requires a different motion and it can be difficult to transfer what you've learned in the lower positions to the upper positions. So she said that when she works with a student, she teaches that as a completely separate idea. That once you're in 5th position, it's a completely different vibrato. At that point, once you're working on those upper positions, you can also start working on speed of vibrato with the vibrato, just really getting a nice ring to your vibrato. So after you practice vibrato, you move on to scales. I enjoyed this section of my conversation with Annie because we're on the phone and she's like, well, Emily, she's very dramatic. Well, Emily, there's what we should do, and then there's what we actually do. I was like, even a Juilliard-trained violinist knows that reality. So Annie said that ultimately, you should probably practice just scales, just for about 10 minutes. You should practice arpeggios then for another 10 minutes. You should then practice double stop scales. She said that she often practices just double stop scales for like 30 minutes. And so she's like, you could practice an hour just on scales. And to quote, because double stop scales are the hardest thing you will ever do in your life. That made me feel much better. She also recommended that you can use a lot of position workbooks that have playing in position exercises in them that are just finger patterns and positions as part of your scale practice because it's training those scale patterns. It might not be a whole scale, but it might be something you might want to supplement in your scale time. Then you practice whatever etude you've been assigned. And you practice that just kind of by, what is needed. And then you practice repertoire. At this point, you've already done an hour of practice at least before you've even gotten to your repertoire, which is why the full hour doesn't always get fit into my schedule. But I know that it's been super helpful for me just to have that kind of layout of even if I don't practice it maybe I don't practice shifting for a full 5 minutes, but that I'm consciously thinking to myself, I'm going to take a couple minutes before I start everything else to do a couple bowing exercises, to do, some articulation exercises. I'm going to go through at least all of these segments to really warm up well and get my body moving properly before I start on my repertoire. I could honestly go on for like a long time about this because we spent a week, an hour a day for a week, learning about the hour. And we learned so much. Like, I'm sure I've forgotten all of it, and I've already called Annie like twice to ask her questions about things. I had a bunch more questions to ask her before I presented here, but our phone conversation got cut off by Annie switching from professional violinist to mother of a 5-year-old boy. She's like, hey Emily, I have to go. David just got a bloody nose, bye. So I didn't get to finish asking her all my questions, but I know it's something that I've really enjoyed. I've started introducing it to my students. It's something that I know that as I go into being a teacher, whether that's teaching private lessons, teaching at a school, is things that I want to be able to apply. So it's kind of my latest nerd thing, and so if you get me started talking about it, I won't stop. And so, yeah, that's the Galamian hour.